Right, today I'm going to be talking about how we can use mixed media, art journaling, and junk journaling type techniques in our nature journals. And I'm super excited to share some of my journals with you today. I have a whole stack here, all organized with different aspects of mixed media that we can use. I have a little piece of brownie that I can eat while I am talking, and I'm going to just dive right in because mixed media can be really fun. It can be decorative. It can help promote a creative and experimental mood. It can help with our composition skills that can then later be applied to nature journaling. It can add to our memories. It can be a form of study, and it can be a way to overcome a fear of drawing or to overcome a creative block. So I'm going to dive into it. But one of the things that I want to talk about is how certain media, mixed media, can be better for certain subjects. So for example, toned paper and colored pencils can be better for drawing bones. Gouache can be really good for drawing skulls. Charcoal can be really good for animal tracks and drawing rocks. Acrylic, pastels, and even oil paints can be used in our nature journals for landscapes. Watercolor and pressed flowers can be used for botanical subjects, and collage and decoupage can be used for ornamentation and for maps or other things that we want to attach into our nature journal. Even things such as gel pens can be really useful for text or for creative borders or highlights. And paint pens can also be really useful. That's what I use on the covers of my nature journals to help me organize them and just to decorate the covers. So those are all of these different sort of mixed media, and a lot of those mixed media can be used in nature journaling. And a lot of people who do nature journaling come from a background where they were using mixed media in other creative ways. So what I'm really curious about is how we can use mixed media in a nature journaling type way and make it our own. So how can we take aspects of nature journaling that are so beneficial and turn these mixed media approaches into nature journaling? So for example, how can we show curiosity? How can we accelerate our learning? How can we use the different languages of nature journaling? So when we talk about how nature journaling is images, nature journaling is words, we also use numbers. How can we use those in a mixed media type way? And instead of just using random stuff in our mixed media or our art journals, how can we make it a little bit more specific to what we're doing? So a lot of times in art journaling or junk journaling, people will take just random pieces of paper and receipts or things that they buy online, different types of old maps, for example, and they'll glue that in. How could we instead make those things sort of more specifically about what we're doing, maybe places where nature journaling? So for example, I think I have an example here. I was at the craft store and I just bought this like piece of scrapbooking paper that had a weird old map on it. Instead of using that, I could print out a map online of a specific place that I'm going to be nature journaling. So for example, I could make a map of the Galapagos and I could print this on some type of antique looking paper. And instead of just getting a random fake antique map at a craft store and putting that into my art journal, I could get something that actually applies to where I live, or I could use maps from a pamphlet from a local park where I go nature journaling. So those are some of the ways that we can, I think, adapt these art journaling techniques and these mixed media techniques and use them in nature journaling. So some of the applications that I think are cool and that I'm going to dive into are incorporating stuff from our small notebooks and putting those onto our regular nature journal pages. So for example, I have been experimenting with some of these smaller notebooks, and I use these for a lot of different notes when I don't want to pull out my entire nature journal. So one technique that could be really interesting, taking from some aspects of scrapbooking, would be to even cut these pages out and then glue them into my regular format nature journal, because I have over here a whole stack of these small sketchbooks over there, like really small ones that I take on trips When I don't pull out my nature journal, I pull those out. How can those be used? So for example, I'll probably today cut out some pages from this. This is actually a little sketchbook that accidentally got put in the washing machine. But instead of just using random pages or random sort of ephemera for scrapbooking, I could use things like this that are actually things that are more meaningful to me and cut those out. And these could be something, maybe this is just a book where you keep quotations, or when you're reading, you make notes here. Anything like that would be much more interesting because it comes from you, and you could put that into your mixed media nature journaling. This one, it already has some sort of interesting weathering effects to it because it accidentally got put through the washing machine. So this could be a cool source of material for a scrapbook type nature journaling exercise. Another thing, obviously, that people do in their scrapbooks that I think we could use in nature journaling is using, including and gluing in maps, tickets, pamphlets, and these can be something that you do before a trip or after a trip. So I'll show you some examples that I have here. I think I have the examples here. Wait, here they are. So I should point out that I've been preparing for the show for at least 4 hours, getting all these materials ready, and there's just stuff all over the place. And it's going to take me a second to sometimes find these things that I want to show you. So obviously you can take things like, here, for example, is a pamphlet from Hallberg Butterfly Gardens. I go nature journal here a lot. And one thing I've never done, and I wish I had, is cut this out, cut out this map, and glue it into my nature journal pages from when I go nature journal there. And that would be a great way to quickly get a map in my nature journaling using some scrapbooking mixed media techniques. You could also draw over that or write in some of the places where you went, how you moved through the property. You could take a photo of this and then print it and have multiple versions even. Here's another example. A lot of local trails will have pretty in-depth maps and other information, including photos that you can cut out and glue into your nature journals, including the text. So instead of just getting something online that has random calligraphy that's supposed to look like it's from Victorian times, you could use things like this that contain information significant to your nature journal page. Another thing which would be funny would be to include receipts when you buy art supplies. You could glue those into your nature journal as a reminder of what you got and how much you spent. Another similar example that I've mentioned before is mini journals and art supplies will come with these pieces of paper that describe some of the technical aspects of that material. And some of these can even be aesthetically interesting, and we can cut these out as well and glue those into our nature journal. One last sort of example in that department is you can print things out such as poems and glue those in, obviously. And then another thing that I think can be an interesting source, especially for people who are nature journaling and gardening, is seed catalogs can be a good source of material. And look at this, there's a lot of interesting illustrations in here, and all of this could be used in a scrapbooking kind of way in your nature journal, especially if you're combining nature journaling with your gardening practice, which I think is an area that needs to be explored more. I know some people are doing it. Another thing that would be cool is, for example, I have this really neat chocolate bar that Eli gave me, and look at how ornamental this this packaging is on the chocolate bar. If you're eating chocolate while you're nature journaling, why not include some of a little reminder of that specific chocolate that you were eating in your nature journal? Or for example, like if you have a tea that you like to drink or a coffee, maybe there's something paper wise that came with that product that you could put into your journal. And the cool thing about this is not only are you getting that sort of interesting junk journaling or art journaling look with the ephemera glued into your nature journal, but it's something that's more connected to you instead of just a random thing that you got on Etsy or picked up at the craft store. There's nothing wrong with that either. I've done that as well, but it's a lot more interesting. And I think in the future, you'll really appreciate it when you look back and it's something that you ate or you drank or was related to a place that you actually were, instead of just some arbitrary faux vintage map, you know, from the 50s or something like that. So that's enough about some of those techniques. And I'm going to go into examples from my books. So I'm going to switch now to my document camera and show you examples of all of these mixed media techniques that I just talked about. I've gone through some of my old nature journals and art journals and organized them and found examples of these different mixed media techniques that can be applied to nature journaling. And I'm going to go through and show you some of these on my document camera right now. Let's see here. Let's get these cameras in order. Also, just want to point out, in America, it's Super Bowl Sunday. So if you're not watching the Super Bowl, maybe your partner is, this is a good time for you to go nature journal while everybody else is distracted watching the Super Bowl. So I'm going to switch cameras here and show you some of what I'm doing. Oh, wait, that's my brownie. I'll eat that later. And I will start by setting up some, oh, that's my toothbrush. This isn't for brushing my teeth. This is actually for using for a splattering technique. You can see a little bit of the splattering technique on this paper here. So I'm going to talk about some of the supplies and mixed media art supplies and materials that I would recommend and not recommend, and give you some examples from my books. Let me get this brownie out of the way. And if you look in the notes for this episode down below, you'll see links to the different supplies that I mentioned. So if you want to check out any of these supplies, you can easily look them up. You don't have to buy them on Amazon. You can just look them up there and see what they are. Obviously, it's better to buy them at your local art supply store. But you can at least look at them on those links that I put down below, so you know what I'm talking about, and I don't have to say a million times in the comments what they are. So let me just get this all set up here. I should probably take a bite of chocolate. Okay. Yes, this is a great, I'm going to actually share this comment right here. This is a great, and this is something I forgot to mention, but look, it would even look good on this page right here. This could be turned, this is basically an envelope already, and you could just glue this onto your page and use this for storing ephemera or leaves or whatever. And one good place to do this would be in the back of your nature journal. So I have some envelopes that I was going to mention that I recently purchased for this. So you can take these envelopes and glue them, maybe like when you have a new nature journal, you can glue them into the front of your nature journal, and you can collect things in there that you use later, or you could just store things in there. So yeah, thank you, Sue. That is a really good, I hadn't even thought about that with this packaging. I don't think I'm going to cut it up now, because this would be a perfect little sort of envelope here that I could store. You know, you could even put little leaves or feathers. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ethics and legality of collecting flowers and leaves and stuff like that in nature later. I think that's a gray area topic for discussion, but this could be a perfect envelope for that. Thank you, Sue, for pointing that out. Oh, Alexandra, that's a great idea. Great idea. Okay, so I'm going to dive into examples here from my journals. I realized last night I was doing a little bit, I thought this show today would be sort of a live demonstration. So I did a little bit of mixed media journaling last night. And what I realized is it took me like 3 hours. And if I were talking to all of you, it would take even longer. So I don't think that I would be able to do much of this and talk to you without the show being infinitely long. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go through some old books and give you examples. And I think that'll be much more interesting for all of you. So the first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is paint pens. Down below in the video description, I have a link for this brand right here. These are Posca. Paint pens are one of the ones that you shake up. This is something that I should mention about mixed media nature journaling is there's a lot more materials. This could be a pro or a con, probably a con, but there's a lot more materials in mixed media nature journaling that are going to get you high. So you probably want to be somewhere with good ventilation. If you're stuck at home in the winter and you're doing like lots of mixed media stuff and you suddenly notice you're having a weird headache, it might be because of the paint pens or the glue or something else. So paint pens are a weird tool. I usually don't use these in nature journaling. Most of you who see me nature journaling in the field see that all I ever talk about is basically a few types of ink tools and watercolors. But some of these are really useful for mixed media nature journaling because, for example, with paint pens, you can decorate the surface of your nature journal. And one thing that has been essential for me is to write the number and use the paint pens for organizing my journals, because I have at this point over 50 of these, and by writing the date and including a number on them on the front cover, it helps me find them and organize them. For a while I was doing decorative stuff on the front, but anyways, that's paint pens. Down below I give the link for the silver one that I like, and I talk about the Posca pens, which you can use. I think this might have actually been with a paintbrush and an acrylic ink, which I mentioned below, but these Posca pens can work in the same way, and they also work on toned paper. Another thing that can be really useful for the multimedia stuff is you can break in your journal, or you can sort of fill in these empty spaces. So I have a whole video about how to start a new nature journal. And one of the things that I mention is that by breaking in these first pages, you can sort of help get over the fear of the blank page. So mixed media techniques are a really good way to do that. And I have more examples of that coming up. But right here, all I did was glue in some pieces of paper where I was doing experiments with acrylic paints. This is watercolor and acrylic inks with some toothbrush splatter on them. So these are just pieces of paper that I then glued in to the front cover of my nature journal. And it's a really great way to sort of break in the blank page. I'm going to check out the chat here. There's so many people commenting. I don't know if I'm going to be able to respond to everybody, but thanks for joining in. Cindy, Jose, Alexandra, Susan, James, Sue, someone on Facebook who I don't know for sure who it is, and Valerie, and Nature Sketches, Charlotte, Jean, maybe some other people that I can't see, but thanks for joining in. I might not be able to answer all of the questions, but I'll do my best to check in every once in a while. Okay, so let's continue here. One other thing I mentioned is that certain types of media are better for certain subject matters. So for example, for drawing tracks, I've experimented with charcoal and with Conte crayons. And these are examples both of Conte crayons. They're sort of like pastels, and charcoal are both really good for drawing tracks. And this is just a piece of paper that I glued in from a watercolor. It's a heavier watercolor paper than what the rest of my paper is made out of. And I created sort of my own toned paper, basically. So you can use watercolor washes or glue in toned paper, and that way you don't have to have a whole journal that's all toned paper, but you can put it in that way. Here's another example of that. So I painted this entire sort of toned paper, and then I also glued in, this is a paper that I dyed with tea, and I glued in this insert of paper, and I'll show you what that looks like by itself. So this is not archival. This is paper that I stained with old tea. And I think I also had sheep's blood in one of these because on the property where I lived, there were a bunch of sheep and they slaughtered one. And for whatever crazy reason, I decided that I wanted to put some of that into this paper staining experiment that I was doing. It's sort of overexposed, but you can see it created a cool sort of edge here. Yeah, so this is some paper that I made on my own. This is not archival. And if you want your journal to last for 1,000 years and think it will be in a museum in 1,000 years, you might not want to put anything like this in your nature journal. If you're not that worried about it, it's fine. And I think it has a cool effect here. I did these anatomical studies on top of it. And here's an example where I actually glued in a page sort of like a folio, so it has its own sort of three-dimensional pocket in here, which I think is really fun. This is another mixed media technique that I'll talk more about later, but this is the ink tints colored pencils. They're water-soluble colored pencil, and I think they're really good for anatomical drawings. And I think this is probably the jumbo correction pen for the white. The Posca pen also comes in a white, but it's not my preferred white. And then here you can see there is, and it's even doing a cool thing on the camera. You can see that I use this silver pen for outlining. So there's a lot of different things going on. This is Tombow pen over here. Tombow pen, I used to play with these a lot more, but I only use this tip. I almost never use that tip. And they come in light colors, which I really like the tone of it. I like the pinks and the grays, but I don't do it that much anymore. So there's an example of that. Here is an example of doing a wash. So this is the kind of thing where you can create your own toned paper without having a toned paper journal. And you can draw over this, especially with like colored pencil or other opaque tools. And that can be really fun. Or you can just use this as a way to fill empty pages. So when I finish a nature journal, I go back through and see where the empty pages are. And if I have empty pages, I can do something such as this. I have this pretty cheap brush that I use for these types of washes. It looks like this is probably just about the one that I used. It's good to have something like this, and this works for some of the glues and Mod Podge that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Even if you don't add anything to this, it can be ornamental at the very least in your nature journal, and you can just leave it like that if you want. I like to use a big lid such as this to mix these kinds of colors. And one thing you might notice is there's a lot of, in watercolor, you would call this granulation. So if you look at this, there's a lot of texture here. Let me see if I can get it close up. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't see it that well, but there's a lot of texture here. And that is actually, I think in this case, caused by me leaving the wash out for a long time in my studio. So I had the ink in here and I let a lot of dust collect. And that dust actually created this very interesting texture. So there's certain things like that that can be really useful. I noticed that Susan B mentioned the smell. I personally, I think that is a really important thing. And it's also a way, it's one of the only ways we can incorporate the sense of smell into a nature journal. I have some pressed flowers here and I haven't used these yet, but these are jasmine and they have an amazing smell as well. So whether you're using tea or you're using pressed flowers, that could be one of the few. You can also add perfume to your pages if you want. Caveat being, if you're trying to make your nature journal last for 1,000,000 years, that might not be the best idea because those smells can actually attract animals that could eat your nature journal. But hopefully that's not an issue for most of us. Oh my gosh, I'm seeing so many great posts in the comments. I see DJ Cati is here. Nature Sketches has some great examples about, and so everybody please check out the live chat. There's a lot of great resources there. I'm not going to be able to see all of them, but I will try my best. So I showed you this example before. This was before my trip to Tanzania. I was practicing the anatomy of many of these African mammals. I think I used one of the white, I think this is some type of white pencil that I'm using for the skull plus graphite. And this is on, I created this toned paper by using I think they're FW inks. So down below, I have a list of the materials, and I mentioned the FW inks, and I mixed my own. Notice how this is not a very saturated color. I don't really like the saturated colors. And this is probably the jumbo correction pin also. Okay, so one last thing in this journal that I want to talk about is including personal stuff maybe in your journal. And this is something that's up to you. But for example, I had a cardiogram done during the time that I was filling this nature journal. And I asked for a copy, a printed copy of it. And I thought it looked so cool. And this is also, instead of me just gluing in some random, random ornamental paper from the scrapbooking box at the, craft store, I have something in here that's actually, this is my heart. So that is way cooler. This is an image showing the beat of my heart and information about my heart. And how cool is that compared to some random, just ornamental piece of paper from a scrapbook thing. So if you have anything like x-rays or whatever, consider putting them in your nature journal. I think it's cool. Obviously that's up to you, but I think personally, this is going to be way more interesting to me in the future. And it has an interesting aesthetic. And then I just glued in these other pieces next to it. All right, so that's it there. Alexander is asking about a luminance colored pencil. I don't think so. I have not tried that type of colored pencil. If you're asking about the white, it is the Pitt Pastel Soft by Faber-Castell. It's sort of like a charcoal pencil, and I have it down below in the description, the video description, a link to it. This is the one that I copied this pencil from Sara Verbacoen. She does a lot of drawing of animals on toned paper, and she did a class at the Wild Wonder Conference. So I got this from her. All right, next one. This one, speaking of colored pencils, we're going to talk about one colored pencil I've experimented with here. And this is a water-soluble colored pencil. Most of you know I hardly use colored pencils at all anymore. It's nice to hear. Oh, hi, Marilynn. And it's nice to hear an example of someone who sort of has a different story about the blank page. So if you don't feel afraid of the blank page, then don't just buy into that concept because other people say that's how it is. So it's cool to hear that Marilynn has a different experience of that. So I no longer have these Inktense pencils because I gave them away during a moment of reducing my art supplies, but I have experimented with them, and the camera is not doing justice for the colors right now, but these are really cool colored pencils, especially the ones that aren't the most saturated colors. If you can get some of the slightly different colors, they can be really fun. And I had this idea, this was done in the rain in Ecuador, and I had the idea for whatever reason that these pencils would be a better alternative to watercolors in wet conditions. So I tried several experiments on that trip using these in wet conditions, and I had mixed results. I don't know if I have another example of them here, but I had mixed results. But anyways, this is a water-soluble colored pencil example. They can be fun. They can be really good for drawing tracks. I think I have an example where I use them for drawing animal tracks, but that's another media that you can use is colored pencil. Sometimes just experimenting with different media is useful. I used to use acrylic paint more, and I would use it to decorate the covers. Right here, maybe this is acrylic ink, and I think I was also experimenting with different media. They call it media. It's like these things you mix into acrylic paint. Okay, let's see. This was actually cut out from a print that I did, so that's mixed media. But what I wanted to talk about here is water soluble ink. So this is a type of pen that almost everybody has. And I think I have an example here somewhere, but these are, well, where is my example? These are these Pilot Precise pens, and I do have this listed down below. These are like really cheap, and it doesn't say anywhere on it that it's water soluble, but it's water soluble. So I used to experiment with these a lot. Here I'm not really taking advantage of the water soluble aspect that much, but you can see it sort of clouds a little bit, and I'm combining it with watercolor. You can get regular ink effects, but you can also use it to this is all watercolor. Actually, here, let me point this out real quick. This is a lot of washes of watercolor, and the paper that I use, sometimes people say that paper is not heavy enough for watercolor. I use 150 GSM paper, this paper right here, 150 GSM. I forget how many pounds that is, but it's not very heavy watercolor paper. But look at how it's barely warped here. And I just want to point out that this paper can definitely handle a pretty good amount of watercolor if you so desire. So another example of the water soluble ink where you can see the sort of effect of the ink blurring a little bit. This can be a useful, if you are a very precise artist like I used to be, then using these can be really helpful because it's going to mess with your precision and force you to try new things and maybe work faster. This is out when I used to lead twice annual trips to see the elk during their rut, during their mating behavior, was always super fun. And so I would have to draw pretty fast, and this watercolor is really fast. You can see there's a fingerprint right there, which means I touched it before it was completely dry. It was also probably humid conditions out there at Point Reyes on the Northern California coast, and these elk are bugling, making their sounds. It's really exciting. There's hundreds of them out there, and this is that water soluble ink here. Sorry, somehow my mic got muted there for a second, so I don't know what's happening with my mic. It sometimes gets unplugged from my computer. Sorry about that. So you probably didn't hear me for a second there. Just some technical difficulties with my equipment. But these can be fun. I used to experiment with them a lot more, and now I don't use them as much. But if all you have is one of these and a water brush, you can achieve quite a lot. If I only had 2 nature journaling drawing tools, with these 2, you can really get a lot done. Okay, moving forward. Let's see if I have another thing from this one I want to share. I think that's it from this book. That's it from this book. All right, moving onwards. Okay, so I'm going to talk about acrylic a little bit more. Here you can see I used acrylic inks on the cover. And I think I have here for like decorating on the inside cover. So this is actually on some sketchbooks, this is really good paper that's on the inside cover. And we often leave that paper and don't do anything with it, but it's a great place to at least create a decorative element. So that's what I've been trying to do lately. You know, like even this, for example, I used to always put this in case my book gets lost. Might as well experiment with a little bit of paint here. And this is acrylic paint. You know, it does surprisingly fine on, you know, only 150 GSM paper right now. So it's not very heavy paper, but you can put like pretty thick acrylic ink on it. So might as well experiment with acrylic ink. And that back cover is even better, especially these Stillman and Byrne books. They have done a pretty good job, at least up until now, of attaching this, using quality paper and attaching it to the cardstock cover pretty well. And here you can see I've used watercolor, I've used acrylic, and I've used a gold paint pen. And I really like how the gold paint pen can be used. So I think, decorating this inside cover is a really good place to use some of these mixed media techniques. And it could be, this is not, I would not call this nature journaling. Even though some of these patterns might be patterns that appear every once in a while in nature, this is more just play and experiment with patterns. And the inside cover is a great place for you to do that with mixed media, such as acrylic paint. All right, so another thing, sort of dry media. This is a more recent journal that I finished, and you can see that my numbers aren't quite as high as they should be because sometimes I have half numbers for the sketchbooks. I shared this sketchbook in a recent video. Usually I share these sketchbooks just with my Patreon patrons, which I should mention, many of you here are already Patreon patrons, but I'll just put up the website for that so that you all know what it is, because it's a great place to find out more and see stuff that I'm doing that other people don't get to see. And even for just $1 a month, you can support the Nature Journal show. And for example, this weekend, we are having a party, patron-only party. So it's a good thing to know about. Anyways, this whole sketchbook was shared in that video, and usually I share the entire sketchbooks just for patrons. But here you can see I experimented a little bit with pastel, and this is pretty new for me. This is pastel on black paper, and I experimented with a landscape. This is a really fun way to try something different, and I think it's good for your brain because it forces you to think about how you use black and how you use white. So for example, usually when I'm doing a watercolor of the coast, I have to reserve my whites, but with the pastels, I actually, on black paper, I had to reserve the blacks. So I had to remind myself to reserve some of the black of the paper to show through. Whereas with watercolor, it's the opposite. Here's another page where I did a similar thing. And you can see I also just taped in sort of this extra page here to, at first I thought the pastel would smear. It turns out it didn't smear very much on the other page, but I basically just created this extra page that could open and close. And all it is cheap paper from the copy machine and a little bit of artist tape. And I basically created an extra page. So if you wish you had more pages in your nature journal, this is an easy way to do that. I did not use any fixative on this pastel. These are the water-soluble pastels on the Canson Me Tense paper, and I have the links for both of those below in case you're wondering which ones they are. And they're not really that messy, and you can see this has not really transferred very much even onto this. This is the protective page meant to capture the messiness, and it hasn't done anything at all. Sometimes I used to glue or tape in pieces of wax paper to protect graphite or things like that, but here haven't had issues with it. But you can really see here a mixture of media, using a lot of different media and just kind of being very free with it and trying different things. Right here, I'm copying an ink drawing by Vincent van Gogh, and right here just playing with cutout paper. Here's sort of a list of like a shopping list. So there's an example of pastels, and I think in both of these cases, I did watercolors of the same landscape at the same time. So that is a good technique. I haven't been using very much. Okay. Going back to Susan is asking about the fixative. So here I did not use a fixative on this at all. And so far I don't see it really showing up on this other side. I mean, there's a teeny bit showing up right there, but sometimes I just want to see. I do use fixative occasionally, but so far I haven't had issues with this. So I'm not worrying about it so far. Oh, here's the example where I did a watercolor version of the same thing. And in this case, for the white, I had to use my jumbo correction pen, which you've probably heard me talk about before. So these are the two opaque white tools that I usually combine with watercolor. This is the Presto Jumbo Correction Pen that I used on that one. Okay, so that's a fair amount of mixed media in that journal, I would say. Yeah, next one. I've got some clippings, which I think is something that nature journalers, it seems like most of the people here have a lot of experience with sort of scrapbooking and art journaling. I think in the nature journaling community, clipping and gluing stuff in, sort of scrapbooking type things, could be used a lot more. And one example is, let's see what the inside cover of this looks like. So I used to do these decorative inside covers a lot, but that's just watercolor. Magazine clippings. So I went with John Muir Laws invited me to go to this Goldman Prize in 2017. And in case you didn't know about, the Goldman Prize is sort of like a environmental Nobel Prize. And they gave us this pamphlet or a magazine with all of the prize recipients. And I wanted to do more about it, but I only ended up getting this one guy who won a prize for his work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's like a type of park ranger, and he was actually kidnapped and tortured by people who are trying to poach and encroach on some of these national parks in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in case you didn't know, Democratic Republic of Congo has some of the most biodiverse rainforest in the world with endemic species. I think it's where the lowland gorillas are. And really courageous people like him are putting their life on the line to protect nature. And so one of the reasons why I stuck this in my journal, it was to remind me that, I'm doing a lot to try to protect nature, but there's people in the world right now who are risking their lives and the lives of their families to try to protect nature. And I thought that was like a really powerful thing to cut his photo out and put it into my nature journal as sort of a reminder. So in addition to quotes, you can cut things out like this from magazines or maybe print photos of people that inspire you. And having that in your nature journal can be sort of a powerful way to kind of as a reminder or like a motivational thing. Here I glued some paper in to write a quote on, and I also took a note of what type of glue I used. So reminding yourself of what glue you use is really important. So this isn't nature journaling either, but I should mention Frisket. So if you work with watercolor, you need to know about resists. So there's masking fluid, Frisket, resists. These are all different ways that you put down something that protects the white of the paper. And experimenting with that, I highly recommend you experiment with that. I've come to the conclusion that it's not really useful in the field. It's really challenging to use in the field. It's even challenging to use in the studio, but you should at least experiment with it so you know about it before you decide to use it or not to use it. I have another example of it here where I did sort of a more complex thing with ink, and these are all resists. So this was all drawn with resists. I did put my favorite resist material in the description down below so you can see it. I don't usually recommend it for nature journaling. I know John Muir Laws does a couple things with crayon resists that are in his book and he uses in the field. But for the most part, I find it a really difficult technique and not worth it to use in the field. It's very messy. But I just wanted to mention that because it is another multimedia technique, is to use resists. Okay, maps. This is something that I think obviously applies to nature journaling. And it's something that could be used a lot more because drawing maps is very challenging. So here is an example where all I did was print out on, I think this is just, this I think is just the really cheap printer paper. And this is a topographic map of the Grand Canyon. And one thing you could do is you could print out maps of a location that you're going to, or a location near your house. It could even be from Google Maps. And then you can have little boxes showing, like, say, this could even just be your neighborhood. And how cool would that be? Instead of like getting some fake antique map from a scrapbook store, you could get a Google map of your neighborhood, glue it into your nature journal. And then when you go nature journaling at the local park, you could just, insert that into here. And that would be a really cool way to take a sort of scrapbooking multimedia technique and apply it to nature journaling. And I think that would be very rich. Another way you can do this is you can make a transfer. So this is an example where I took a topographic map and I printed it, and then I put graphite on the back. I think I used, I don't know where it is. I used a big graphite stick or like charcoal, and I drew on the entire back, and then I taped it onto this page, and I traced out the river, the Colorado River, this important mountain, the location of these rapids. This is like, this is one of the most deadly rapids on the Colorado River that we were going to go through. So I wanted to include that in my nature journal. And then I did watercolor on top of it. There's another trick about maps that I'm going to show you. And that is this. This is a trick that I learned so that you don't have to learn it. Because I spent a lot of time figuring this out. But what you can do is this right here is regular printer paper. And I printed a map of the Galapagos. I mean, it took me 5 minutes to find this really simple black and white map of the Galapagos. Look how easy that is. I could cut this out and do all kinds of things, ornamental things with it. But I could also use multiple versions of this in my nature journal. And I could glue it in, maybe before I go or after, whatever, and add notes to it. But what I wanted to point out is if you print these on resume paper, and you can get this almost anywhere, you can get this resume paper and it's cotton. So I think it's 100% cotton. And if you know, cotton is exactly what Arches uses for their pro watercolor paper. So if you print, and this resume paper is really cheap, if you print a map or something like that on this paper, and it's only 120 GSM, you can do a really nice watercolor wash onto this paper and then attach that into your nature journal. So I highly recommend, if you have a printer or if you have a print shop nearby, that you get some resume paper, and then you can print whatever you want. I mean, you could print photos of animals or anything too. And then you can watercolor on that paper, and it works really well, especially compared to the regular printer paper. It works quite well. I'm going to share this comment from DJ Cati while I drink a little bit of water. That is a great idea. That is a super, super cool idea. Thank you, DJ Cati, for sharing that. Polaroids or a Polaroid. I haven't even heard of a portable Bluetooth Polaroid printer, but that sounds really cool. And for whoever this is on Facebook that is intimidated by drawing maps, you're not the only one. There's a lot of information in those maps, like crazy amount of information. I can't even find where my one went that I had the maps, but if you can print them out, it really speeds it up. This is not the most complex map, but even just printing this would be really challenging. I mean, drawing this to scale and everything would be really challenging, but it took no time at all to print it on this resume paper. And you can often find these, like if you wanted to do all the writing yourself, you could find a version of this map with none of the writing on it. You could print it, you could do your own calligraphy, you could do your own watercolor, and the resume paper really makes it come out nice. And you can get an ivory colored one. So instead of, getting those, those vintage or like antique looking world maps are pretty cool. And you can get those at, craft stores and all of that. But you can simulate that by getting some of the ivory version of this. And down in the video description below, I have a link for the ivory colored resume paper, and you can make your own. And it's just kind of taking control more of the creative process, instead of it just being like I'm buying all of these supplies and then just sort of slightly rearranging them. It's taking a little bit more control. So now that I mentioned the resume paper, I'm going to go into paper a little bit more in detail. I think it's really important. Oh, here is the example of the sort of generic type faux vintage maps, faux antique maps that you can get. I bought this at the craft store, and I'm still going to use this. But I was sort of on a shopping spree yesterday because I was getting stuff for the show, and I was like, oh, I should get that. And then later, like last night, I realized, wow, I can make my own versions of this. But this is still, there's a place and time for this, but it's like, how connected is this to me? Is this totally random? Or would it be like way more interesting to have a map that I chose myself that could be about a place that's connected to me? Maybe it's a place that I'm just dreaming about, but it's a place that's connected to me. Or even my own neighborhood could look really interesting on Google Maps or Google Earth. And then I watercolored it myself. That would just be way more interesting than using this generic thing that there's probably, you know, thousands of these exact same maps printed, and there's probably thousands of other people that have used this in their scrapbook. Whereas, you know, if I print one on resume paper that I chose myself and I watercolor it, then that is really unique. But while I'm talking about paper, I want to mention it is really easy to cut paper out and glue it into your nature journal. So for example, this I got on sale, and it's some paper that's supposed to be for oil painting. And you can just cut these out. I have experimented with using watercolor on it. You could easily cut these heavier pieces of paper out and glue them into your journal so that you could even do some oil painting experiments inside of your nature journal. You can paint washes on them and then cut them out and use those, like some of the examples I've showed. Here is the black pastel paper. It has a really great texture, and this just works really nicely for pastels, like for landscapes. And you can paint in here with the pastels and then cut it out and put it in your nature journal, because it's way cooler to have those landscapes in a journal than in something like this. I've always regretted it when I have like a bunch of random sketch pads like this or like this and some watercolor ones, and then I just have to deal with all of these loose sheets of paper in a bunch of different places. Whereas if it's all in my nature journal, it's way better. Like I mentioned before, you can make your own tea paper, and then you can glue these into your journal, and that will all be in one place as well. And then also there's things like this, where I definitely wouldn't want to keep very many drawings in something like this. They fall out very easily. It's not an appealing cover at all. It has sort of a cheapness to it. It's a random size, but if you take these out of here and glue them into your nature journal, that gives you a lot more options. Ooh, I didn't know about that. Thanks for pointing that out. Also, this is very interesting from Sue. That is a good point, comparing old maps with new maps. And Christine, this is a good point that I should have mentioned before that I haven't. So thank you, Christine, for bringing this up, is that junk journaling and art journaling can be ways to recycle materials, which is really cool. So instead of throwing stuff away, I've seen people use even their junk mail and put that into their journals. So that is a really, thank you, Christine, for bringing up that point. That is really important. So I have a couple more types of paper that I want to talk about. Here, you've probably seen me. I mean, this is Stillman and Burn, and it's all in one thing. There's definitely benefits to having, you know, these multiple types of toned paper in one journal. For me personally, I would rather have control over when I have brown paper and when I have black paper and when I have gray paper, and then go sort of chronologically. However, there are benefits, you know, to having this all in one, but you could also take some of these pages out and glue them into another journal is always an option. And then the last type of paper I'm going to talk about is isometric graph paper. So isometric graph paper has these sort of triangles, and what it means is isometric is a type of perspective. So it gives the illusion of three-dimensionality without a vanishing point. So all of these lines are all going off at the same angle. They're not like changing angle at different places on the paper. So this is a type of perspective that was actually used in a lot of Turkish and Arabic miniature art. So if or some Chinese as well, I believe. So if you ever look at that, and it's also used by engineers and plumbers and stuff, but it can be really fun for calligraphy and for just patterns. But this type of graph paper, even by itself, is fun to play with, but this could be a really good thing to cut out and then glue into other glue into your nature journal. So I posted a link to a version of this that's on 8.5 by 11 paper, because last night I was going to cut a piece of this and glue it into my journal, but because of the format, it was really hard to figure out how to cut it without losing some of the aspects of the designs. And so I think the 8.5 by 11 version that I included in the links is going to be better. This is acrylic paint with metallic paint pens that I was experimenting with, and I was mixing complementary colors. So here you can see the purple and the green. This purple and this green mixed together is how I made this brown. And similarly, this purple and this orange mixed together created that brown. I think that's what I did. This is old, but I'm going through all my art supplies, cutting this stuff up and using it in my journal as sort of ephemera and scrapbooking type material. My last thing that I'm going to talk about here is pressing plants. These are just more examples of envelopes. I think I've talked about those already. I'm going to talk about pressing plants, but I think I should probably eat a piece of chocolate first. Where's my brownie? I'd say that's a pretty good piece of brownie right there. Oh, yeah. Oh, there's a couple more things I wanted to mention. Okay, so pressed plants. Susan B, this is a good comment here. Yes. Book binding. Now we're talking. Talk about a cool art form where you can really take your nature journal to the next level. I want to do a show where I interview some people who are doing that. So Susan, if you are doing that, let me know. Or if you know anyone else who's doing that and combining it with nature journaling, let me know. Kind of on the same theme here from Sue. The thing that I find challenging is with the nature journaling, I don't necessarily know what kind of paper I'm going to need for what thing happens or what comes up in nature or in my own mind. So sometimes like that's what I don't like about this Stillman and Burn journal. I think it's really cool that they put 3 different types of toned paper. But if I start this journal and suddenly I'm like, oh, I really need the black paper right now. For me, it feels weird to like skip into the black paper section, do a little bit of journaling, and then go back. There's something about it. Like what I'm trying to figure out is how can I learn how to kind of use some of these scrapbooking techniques to be able to like in the moment or as close to in the moment, like cut something out from another place, stick it in. Like, if I have this other journal page, cut this and put it there, or if I have the pressed flowers, like incorporate that like right then in that moment. So anyways, that's one of the things that I find hard about like planning in advance, like which color pages I'm going to need or which weight paper I'm going to need when. There might not be a total solution to that. Wow, so many good comments here. Lots of good comments from Cindy, from James. I would be interested to know more what you mean here, James, making a mini book for your main nature journal. That might be this. One thing I was thinking of doing was like having a in the back of my nature journal, having a envelope like this, and then having a small journal like this. Like, so when I went to Tanzania, I had a small journal like this for when I didn't have time to pull out my big nature journal. And if I just had an envelope there where I could include that, and it would always stay with the big journal, maybe that's what you mean. That would be a really cool technique. And I feel like these are the sort of things that could be really interesting in the future for nature journalers. People could develop some of these strategies, would be really interesting. So it sounds like Susan is doing some bookbinding. Oh, yes, Cindy, I think this could be the solution right here. This is awesome. That is, okay, I need to write that down or somehow remember that, because that is genius. And I think the solution could be, so for example, I'm going to mention this in a moment when I talk more about glues, but this Tombow glue is pretty portable. This could probably go in your nature journal kit that actually goes to the field with you. You know, it's probably easier than carrying like a whole thing of Mod Podge into the field. But this, and then if you have this envelope in your nature journal with some of those cut out pieces of paper ready to go. So for example, I could have this heavier piece of watercolor paper right here. I could have black paper. Where's my black paper? Whatever. I could have some of this tone paper stuck in there. And then when I needed to, I could pull this out and just glue pieces of this into my nature journal. I love that idea, Cindy, and I'm going to write that down so I don't forget. And I'll just stick this sticky note to the envelope. Great idea. Okay. So onwards, yes, I love that. Plastic CD or DVD pockets, great idea. Oh, they have a sticky back already. Very cool. This audience is so full of information and creative ideas. Okay, so here is and I'm really excited to hear, I didn't even realize that Roseanne had a plant press. I'm going to look at hers because I think the one I have might not be that great. Here is a white sage plant that I pressed, and it's rather three-dimensional. I think I shared this in a recent episode, so some of you might have seen this already. And then what I actually used for adhering it was just Elmer's glue. And a friend who does a lot of sort of like museum stuff and bookbinding stuff and archival stuff said Elmer's glue is made out of animal products. So anything made from animals has the potential to attract other animals in the future that might want to come and try to eat the paper or things like that. So this might not have been the ideal glue for the most longevity, but it seems to have worked fine. This also smells really nicely because it's white sage. It's a very aromatic plant. And I like it just as an ornamental. This is the last sort of, this is that part of the book that usually goes to waste. A lot of sketchers and artists don't put anything here. A lot of nature journalers don't put anything there, and it goes to waste. But this pressed plant here, I think just adds nicely. You know, like I already did my index. I have the full index, and I have this sort of wasted page here. So I put that there, and I like how it turned out. Now I'm going to talk about some other ways that we could potentially do pressed plants, because I think pressed plants is a frontier for nature journaling. And for a lot of reasons, it can be quick, and it can also be good for people who are not very confident in their drawing skills. I'll show you another example. Oh wait, I should show you these ones. These ones, I just took these random pieces of paper. I used some toothbrush splattering. So basically just, I made a mixture, a sort of watercolor mixture or ink mixture here. And then I flicked it like this with the toothbrush. Works really good for creating this pattern here and just a wash. And one thing I like to do, these were for cards. I think this was for Mother's Day. And I just made like 10 of these because I didn't know how they would turn out. So I wanted a bunch of different ones, and each one had different flowers pressed into it. You know, I don't like the industrial process for many reasons, but there's things from industrialization that we can apply. So like if you're going to make a card and you're going to experiment with these watercolor or flower pressing techniques that take a long time, if you do 5 of them, then you'll have a better one to choose from. So like if you didn't like the way the jasmine flowers came out and you don't want that to be your card, then you have like 5 other ones. So just doing sort of, it's called batching, doing a batch of pressed flowers or a batch of these watercolor washes on paper, or if you're going to make tea paper, make a whole bunch of them all at once, and then you can pick the ones that you like. So I batched those, and then I could use them later. So these can be really good for people who are just learning to draw and are maybe not very confident in their drawing skill, because you could apply all of the same nature journaling techniques later to this. Like this could be turned into a species profile, and I could have all of my notes on it and a bunch of information there. This is a good point. Good point. Very good point. So watch out for that. Be aware that that could be a problem. There's probably workarounds to that. Another good point here is parchment paper or wax paper is really useful. And I think when I pressed these, I did have wax paper inside of there so they wouldn't stick to each other. These are borage flowers, and I'm amazed by the color that they still have. There's nothing over them. And then the last example I'll give you is what I did last night. What I did last night was, so I have this huge journal here. This is the biggest journal ever. I think it's like, wait, let me switch cameras so you can actually see the size of this. This is a huge journal. As you can see, I use it mainly for exercise. That's how I get in shape. It's also really good as a weight for holding down things while you're gluing them. But last night I decided I would experiment in it with some different sort of art journaling and scrapbooking techniques. So I used some different papers and some different printouts and things like that, and glued them into here. And I did glue in this salvia. This is another species of salvia flower right here. And for this, I did use Mod Podge. I'm sure some of you are way more expert at this than I am. This was basically my first time using it, and I painted it on with this brush here. I used it for the most part on this page. This is the first page of the journal. For the most part, I used the Mod Podge as the glue, but I also used it as a sealer. So this flower is completely covered in the Mod Podge. And I chose the matte because I usually like matte as opposed to glossy. And I think it's pretty good. And you can still see the colors of the flower. You can see the details on the leaf even. And I think it looks fine. It's protected a lot more. So that is a way you can apply some scrapbooking techniques like into the front of your nature journal, for example, and still have the rest of your nature journal, just your normal nature journaling. And the glues that I experimented with last night were this Tombow. I like it because this seems like something that someone thought about a lot before building it. They have a really nice applicator tip here. It seemed really convenient and worked really well. They have a big side and then they have a small side that's really fine. And I think this is something that I would actually experiment with carrying in my nature journal kit. This worked really well, and I love that it can be a sealer as in addition to a glue, and I want to experiment with that more. This is also ridiculously cheap. I posted it down in the description in case you've never used it before. You can find that link and buy it. It also comes in like a gallon, or like I think it comes even in like 100-gallon sizes. But this stuff is super cheap, really easy to use. and it's been around for a while. This is sort of more new, I would say, and maybe more convenient in your actual nature journal kit. So I'll try it for that. Now I'm just going to share a couple last things here that I think could be fun tips. And I did talk about a lot of the materials. Geez, there's so many more that I could talk about. There's like some of these like gold paints that can be fun. I did mention, and I have the link for these below, but these are the pastels that I used. They look especially good on that black paper. Everybody knows about the watercolor that I use already. And I mentioned the paint pens. So I think that's probably most of it. Oh, I don't recommend using super glue. I did experiment with it because I thought this would be convenient in my nature journal kit. It's not archival, and it does weird things to paints and colors that are nearby. Also, it can leak. It leaked a little bit in my nature journal kit and was starting to stick to all of my chocolate, and that just means it has to go right away. It's really cheap, but not worth it. A couple last things that can be sources for material. I mentioned seed catalogs can be really cool. Sometimes at libraries you can find old books, and I know a lot of people will probably flinch at the idea of cutting pages out of old books, but this book, even though it says, you know, masters of Italian drawings, a lot of these drawings aren't really master drawings in my opinion. This one, however, is like supposedly the first landscape drawing Leonardo da Vinci ever did, and I would probably feel okay cutting this out of this book and gluing it into my nature journal, because you can use sort of some of these scrapbooking techniques as a study method, and taking artists that you emulate or want to copy and practice, you could glue this into your nature journal and then just practice maybe copying some of the techniques there. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. Another sort of old book that you can find at some of those library sales is sometimes there's old field guides like this. Some of the information might even be out of date, but if you get one of these that's like to your area and you cut out some of these pages, this would be already so much more interesting than just totally random, arbitrary scrapbooking pages. And you could learn some stuff about local flowers and maybe apply nature journaling techniques to this instead of just approaching it from an aesthetic point of view. So maybe you could ask questions, you could do sort of a species profile, you could build a diagram off of one of these, things like that. And there are some colored plates as well that you could cut. I know for a lot of us, like cutting up a book feels really hard to do, but those are some places where you might be able to get away with it. Obviously, magazines are great. Another thing I want to point out, and if JP is watching, she's probably going to freak out because she gave me this amazing book, but dust covers. I personally am not a huge fan of dust covers on my books. I think a lot of dust, I mean, this is a well done dust cover and it has beautiful stuff on it. A lot of dust covers are sort of unnecessary, and if you're reading the book a lot, they kind of get in the way. I like books that have like, you know, like that is so much more classy to me. It's fabric. It has this like silver embossed thing. I can, you know, it has everything on the spine that I need to know. So what I often do is I just end up throwing dust covers away. But talk about a place where you could cut out some good material and use that in your scrapbook or your art journal. And in this case, these are things related to fishing and fish that I think apply to nature journaling. And I'm personally, for example, often drawing tarpon at the California Academy of Sciences in my nature journal. So this is something that I could maybe cut out and stick in next to one of those pages. I've got some tips here that I want to go over. I talked about printing things out, quotes, poems. You can print out research. So if you printed out like a bird list, for example, or something on Wikipedia about a species or a location, you're going to go nature journal, glued that into your nature journal. That'd be a really great way to use a scrapbooking technique for nature journaling. Photos that you took in the field, printed out those photos. Someone mentioned this before. I think it was DJ Cati mentioned printing things out and then gluing them in. Artists you are studying. So printing out things that made by that artist and gluing into your nature journal, that would be a great strategy as well. And then you can do your own drawings next to it, because I really think copying other artists is actually a great way to learn. Okay, a couple tips that I have for how to actually go about this is one really important tip is to sort of figure out your space. So planning your space in advance. Are you going to glue these in before your trip, after your trip? Are you going to have like a practice where when you're done, you go back and add the multimedia stuff on the cover or on the inside cover? What is your system for that? Or is it, do you use multimedia as a way to break in your nature journal? Here you can see graphite and ink on the first few pages. This could be a fun way to break in a new nature journal. So how are you going to use it? How are you going to plan for the space? And, you know, I have piles of journals falling over on the ground. How are you going to use it? Like, can you come up with a system? Are you going to be doing the multimedia stuff before or after your field journaling? So like I'm going to be going to the Galapagos pretty soon, and I'm trying to think, how can I print maps, glue them into a journal in advance? What different types of paper would be useful to glue into my nature journal? Should I include little envelopes for like tickets and receipts, things like that? And then you can also do a lot of these multimedia techniques after your nature journaling experience and include them and stick them in. But then you have to create space for that. So like if you fill your pages up completely and then afterwards you're like, oh, I wish I could cut out some of the stuff from my little sketchbook and glue them into my big sketchbook, it might be too late. There might not be space. So one thing to do is to save materials. We talked about the idea of having an envelope in your sketchbook where you keep those and you can save receipts and things like that. Another thing I recommend is maybe having some type of folder like this where you could save clippings, envelopes in your journal. All those kinds of things can work. This is a big one where I've saved, you know, a lot of my color experiments, and all of these things were a really good learning process in the moment, but I can use them as ornamental elements for scrapbooking, and these are mostly acrylic paints. So having a place where you store that, I know a lot of you probably have art stuff stored everywhere and save everything, but can be useful. And then we talked about the resume printer. One thing, I did mention a lot of new art supplies in this video, but I don't want multimedia nature journaling to be just an excuse for you to go out and exercise, what's it called, shopping therapy, and just like buy a bunch of stuff instead of actually doing art. And actually, I think multimedia nature journaling can be a way for you to use your old art. So like if you have piles of like loose paper and loose sketches and things like that, putting those and gluing those into a sketchbook is such a better way to have it organized. Like I personally am so glad I don't have flat files or art in loose sheets of paper. Art on loose sheets of paper is so annoying and so hard to deal with. But if you cut those things out and glue them into other nature journals, that can be a great thing to do. So those are some of my tips. Some of the materials down below, all of the materials that I mentioned are listed. Oh, I just saw something that Recovering Soul posted. No, everyone can see your comment. I think I just haven't been able to follow all of the comments here. Very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So amazing tips in the live chat. After this live video is over, it is possible to go over on YouTube, and in the side column, you can watch the live chat happening while you watch the recorded version of the video. And you can get all of this information from people like Recovering Soul, Christine Hart, Susan B, DJ Ketty, Cindy. All of these people have been sharing amazing stuff. James Coleman, all of these people have been sharing really great information. And when you watch the video as the recorded version, you can see all of that. So I hope everybody's really excited about Super Bowl Sunday. If you're not, remember that you can just nature journal while your partner is watching Super Bowl Sunday. not a problem. And thanks for joining in. You can find out more and get some behind the scenes stuff on my Patreon. And for as little as $1 a month, you can support the show. And we're having a patron only party this coming weekend. There's a bunch of other really cool perks. We have several nature journal kits that get mailed from member to member that people can try out. And so it's a great way to support the show and learn some other stuff and be part of a really cool community. And this community is amazing as well. There's like 40 people watching this right now. Thank you all so much. Give it a thumbs up down below and put a comment in if you've learned something or you have something to contribute. It's been a really, really great live show. So I've learned so much from all of you. So thank you so much once again. Cindy, Shirley, Charlotte, Recovering Soul, Alexandra, Jean was here. So many people. Loretta, whole bunch of people. Loretta's asking about my necklace. No, these are actually seeds from Northern California. They're madrone berries. Great question, Loretta. All right, everybody, have a good super nature journaling Sunday. Bye.